Good afternoon, and welcome to our policy webinar for our all grantees. We're pleased that you're able to join us today. Next slide. To begin, we wanted to share a little housekeeping information for everyone's knowledge. First, everyone will remain muted throughout the course of the presentation and the question and answer portion as well. We've done this to avoid the possibility of any interruption from unintended background noise. We will, however, be taking questions at the end of the presentation. We're asking everyone to add their questions to the chat box, and we'll pull from there to respond to them. We might not be able to get to all of the questions, but are planning a follow-up at a later time for those that we were not able to address. Also, if you are noticing any glitches, lagging, or freezing, we will suggest that you turn off your computer's camera and any other open applications on your computer. This should help if you're having any bandwidth issues. And then lastly, this session is being recorded today so that we can share it with you and those that might not have had an opportunity to join with us. Next slide. The team listed here are the individuals that you'll hear from. That includes Akam Rahman, Iris Curtis, yours truly, Vicki Pretlow, Patrice West, Josephine Ragoadia, and Kate Thomas. Lauren Christopher is also joining us to participate in the question and answer portion of the call, and John Thompson is joining us to facilitate that process. And this is our agenda for the day, which is pretty straightforward. We're wrapping up with our welcome. I hope you all feel sufficiently welcome. Akam will provide some opening remarks and the objectives in just a minute. He will be followed by Iris Curtis, who will provide some critical information on fiscal matters. Your 4 regional liaisons will present on some key guidance issues, and then we'll wrap up with some questions and answers from the chat box. Again, we really appreciate everyone's time and attendance, and we hope that the information provided today will be helpful to all of you. And with that, I will turn it over to Akam to provide us with his remarks. Akam?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Vicki. Thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to our first policy webinar of 2021. Our objective today is to give you an urgent reminder and then show you some guidance-related answers we gave in 2020 and so far in 2021. We'll have additional webinars in the future to drill down on some of those questions. As you know, it has been a challenging time in many different fronts. Also, it is the time when LIHEAP allocation reached all-time high. Acknowledging the need for additional home energy assistance during this pandemic, Congress appropriated over $5 billion in supplemental funding. First, $900 million under the CARES Act in 2020, and then an additional $4.5 billion this year through the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. The Division of Energy Assistance held a policy webinar last year, issued program guidance, introduced LIHEAP plan submission flexibilities, supported our grantees with one-on-one and group technical assistance, held the first virtual conference, and issued separate reporting guidance for supplemental funds. A lot took place within the last 15 months. At the same time, LIHEAP grantees made programmatic changes in many different areas. Broadly, they covered eligibility determination, application timeframes, increased benefits, and remote application. These changes showed a highly responsive LIHEAP network. Moving on to data. Although initial data shows that fewer households were weatherized in 2020, more households got cooling and crisis assistance in fiscal year 2020 compared to 2019. You can view this 2020 data in the LIHEAP Performance Management website's Data Warehouse section. The question is, how can we continue these flexibilities and serve more households with higher benefit levels? That's where intentional policymaking comes into play. I would like you to think about the following questions. Am I looking at my data for trends, especially to support more at-risk households? Who can I reach out to serve newly eligible households? How can I review my local level data to know more about underserved and disadvantaged urban and rural communities so that I can reach out to more households? Tribal grantees can do the same for their tribal areas. How can I make sure that the maximum possible benefit is given to households with lowest income? Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list. I strongly encourage you to think about questions like these so that no funds remain unused. Our office will also reach out to grantees that haven't drawn down significant amount of funds already from CARES Act account. Next slide, please. Okay, here's a question for you. Is it too late to make changes to your program? The obvious answer is a no. It is not too late to make changes to your program and obligate more CARES Act and other funding. If you are expecting the need to make changes, do it now. You have roughly 2 months until September 30th to obligate CARES Act and other funds. Iris will talk about this soon. Throughout the webinar, you will hear about program flexibilities. Here are a few ways you can make changes. For example, you do not need to redetermine eligibility. You can issue supplemental benefits to already approved households. As you know, it's a federal requirement to set aside a reasonable amount of crisis funds through March of each year. That does not mean that you cannot run a year-round crisis program. There is no federal maximum LIHEAP benefit. It's left up to you to make the decision based on local needs. Our speakers will discuss these and other flexibilities in detail. Now I'd like to hand over the presentation to Iris Curtis. Iris?
Thank you, Akam. All right, so I'm going to talk about the fun part, the spending of your money and obligating those funds. So I know that right now you should have about 4 funding sources that you're working with. You have your fiscal year 20 funds, 2021 funds, CARES Act, and your ARC funds. And so in 2020, you should have obligated at least 90% by September 30th of 2020. And hopefully you're obligating that remaining 10%, or if you have less, and that has to be obligated by September 30th of this year. Then with your 2020 funds, you have to obligate 90% of that by September 30th, and then you can carry over the remaining 10% maximum into next year. For your CARES Act funds, we told you that in 2020, you could obligate anywhere from 0 to 100%, but you have to obligate 100% of those funds by September 30th of this year. And I just want to remind you that for all CARES Act funding that have not been obligated by this deadline of September 30th, 2021, those funds will be forfeited and sent back to Treasury. So we don't have, any leeway here to allow you to obligate past that September 30th date. So we just really, really stress to you the importance that you have to have all of those funds obligated by September 30th of this year. And then, of course, with the ARC funds, we told you you could obligate anywhere from 0 to 100% of those funds in this fiscal year, but you will have to obligate 100% by September 30th of 2022. And I really want to stress the importance of obligating these CARES Act funds, because after September 30th, you won't have that opportunity anymore. So please make sure that you are obligating those funds. As Akam mentioned before, he gave you some suggestions on how to obligate, and you will hear from our 4 liaisons very shortly, giving you some more ideas and answering questions on how you can do that. All right, next slide. And so, of course, first in obligating those funds, then we talk about the expenditure of those funds. And we don't have a definition of how or when you can expend those funds. But if you remember in our regulation 45 CFR 9630, that your funds must be expended according to the same rules that you expend your state tribal, or your territorial funds. So if your state, tribal, territory says that you have to expend those funds within a year, then you would need to expend these funds within that same time period. So it's very important that you've obligated first by September 30th, and then that will have an impact on how you can expend those funds. But you have to obligate them first. So please make sure you're doing that. The next slide I want to talk to you, I want to show you a little bit. We've been in contact with other offices about your obligating and your drawing down of the funds because this is a very crucial time. We have about 2 months left. And so we want to make sure that you are obligating those funds. If you look at this first chart, in that second column, these are the total amount of funds that HHS has awarded to each of you. Okay, and so we've awarded states $884 billion, $million. For the territories, it's $4.5 billion, and then for tribes, $10.4 billion. And we've noticed that states have drawn down about 74%, territories 11%, and tribes about 50%. And this data is as recent as July 21st. So every week we are continuing to reach out and say, hey, how are our grantees doing? Are they obligating? Are they drawing down the funds? Because we want to make sure that you're doing this and we're reaching out to you. We hope that you are reaching out to us as well if you need some advice or if you need some guidance on how to do that. In the next slide, it talks about from a regional view, and we're looking at the different regions. If you can see at the bottom of the slide, the burgundy represents territories, the blue represent tribes, and then there's like a kind of a tan color that represents the states. And so we know that in some areas you may have more tribes or more more territories. But in Region 10, we're noticing that there are 18 tribes that have drawn down less than 50% of their funds. And so that data is presented according to each of the regions. But this gives you an idea, gives us an idea of who we need to reach out to and who we can give assistance on getting these funds obligated. In the next slide, it just gives talks about grantees, tribes, and territories, a percentage of who of those have not obligated or drawn down their funds as of July 21st. Of course, this is as of last week. And so we are concerned. We see that a lot of you still have not drawn down or obligated your funds. Reach out to us. That's what we're here for. If you have questions on what you can do, and also according to the information that hopefully you will receive in this webinar, you're going to get more ideas about how to do that. We really want to help you. We don't want it back. We don't want you to send the funds back. We want to make sure that the clients are receiving these funds. We know there is a need. So work with us and we'll work with you in getting these funds obligated. All right, and that's all that I have at this time, and I'll turn it over to Akam.
Thank you, Iris. These are very important points. I would like everyone to remember what you just saw on the screen and what you heard from Iris about the obligation timeframe. Now we are going to take a deeper dive into the policy areas. But before I go to our next speaker, I would like to acknowledge program specialists Vicki Pretlow, Patrice West, Josephine Ragoadia, and Kate Thomas of my operations team. I would like to thank them for their commitment in preparing responses to hundreds of grantee questions during this pandemic. Without further delay, let me hand over the presentation to Vicki Pretlow. Vicki?
Thanks, Akam. Hello again, everyone. I'll be covering some key questions that our office has received from grantees regarding eligibility today. Eligibility requirements are found in the LIHEAP statute at section 2605B2. This section identifies those households who may be eligible to receive LIHEAP assistance and provides grantees with the flexibility to include as eligible all of those households identified in the law or to limit eligible households to a smaller group. Although the law allows categorical eligibility, such as those households receiving assistance through TANF, grantees must also offer eligibility to households on the basis of income, as required by Section 2605B8 of the LIHEAP statute. The statute does not define income or specify what types of household income should be counted when determining income eligibility. What will be counted as income is left to each grantee to determine, except for those program benefits and resources that are mandated to be excluded from income when determining the eligibility for federal programs. Next slide. So in keeping with that, our first question under eligibility today is what types of income must be excluded and what can be excluded? In general, as stated, each LIHEAP grantee has the authority under the federal LIHEAP statute to define income for the purpose of determining income eligibility for their program, as long as it's in accordance with how each grantee treats income for its own state or tribally funded assistance programs. We do, however, have some items that must be excluded in grantee income calculations. These include the non-cash values of SNAP and WIC. As it relates to CARES funding, LIHEAP grantees should not consider the economic impact payments as income for eligibility. And those were those payments for everybody where folks received up to $1,200 and then an additional $500 for each child. Additional details and explanation about this are provided in the DCL that was released regarding CARES funds. And also the child tax credit should not be included in the income calculation. Information on this was also shared a few weeks ago with all grantees. As for the items that can be excluded or included, the first that we wanted to mention is the CARES Act unemployment compensation payments. This is a local decision. And if grantee rule allows it, grantees may even treat these CARES unemployment benefits differently than the regular unemployment insurance benefits. Also, any of the other items listed on the model plan in Section 1 are at the grantee's discretion for use in the income calculation. Our second question from a grantee is if the program can set a 130% federal poverty guideline income limit for its first year applicants and adjust it to 150% federal poverty guideline income limit for those households that were approved in the prior year. So for example, if a household applied in 1 year, they must be at or below 130%. If they come back in the second year, they're able to have an income limit at or below 150%, or this was at least what the grantee asking the question was proposing. Federal LIHEAP statute does not speak to the specificity of this practice. Therefore, we would consider it a local decision. As LIHEAP is a block grant, grantees have the flexibility to set their own administrative and other local policy requirements within a set of broad parameters found in the statute. We would ask that the grantee refer to their own rules as it relates to such practices. However, income limits must not exceed the federal caps listed in Assurance 2, which of course are the 150% FPL or 60% of the SMI. Any grantee considering this must also ensure that it remains in compliance with the requirements in Assurance 5, which require grantees to provide in a timely manner the highest level of assistance is furnished to those households having the lowest incomes. Next slide. Question 3. Will the grantee be allowed to increase eligibility to 200% of the federal poverty guidelines? In short, the answer is no. The 200% is only applicable to Department of Energy weatherization income limits. And of course, LIHEAP weatherization may adopt 100% of the DOE rules to follow. But if grantees are using LIHEAP rules, they can only use either the SPL or the SMI. To qualify a larger number of households, grantees can consider using SMI instead of SPL because it's generally higher. Next slide. The next grantee asks, are we allowed to pay past due balances? For this question, a little background. The grantee was providing a utility company with a pledge to pay for approved LIHEAP applicants for use toward their prepaid accounts. The grantee later found out from the vendor that the entire pledged amount would be going toward arrearages or past due amounts, which left the household without utilities because, number one, the grantee was not previously informed of that particular vendor's policy before it was implemented. And then also the pledge amount was less than the past due amount. So the grantee was interested in learning how to move forward in this scenario. In short, this also would be a local decision. The LIHEAP statute does not prevent grantees from paying past due balances. However, if a payment does not resolve a crisis, this may not be the best use of funds. Grantees might consider leveraging other available funds to ensure that the crisis is resolved for the maximum benefit of the household. We'd also like to point out that although they're not required, situations like this highlight the importance of having vendor agreements with specific language in place that clarifies LIHEAP grantee expectations and vendor responsibilities. We also would encourage revisiting any vendor agreements, the language in those agreements periodically as necessary. The next question was specifically related to the ARP funds. The grantee stated that under their 2021 LIHEAP program, they implemented service priority for applicants who are elderly, disabled, and families with young children. Under ARP, they were considering removing this prioritization requirement and allowing services to be provided on a first come, first served basis, as long as the household met the income eligibility requirements and any other LIHEAP eligibility requirements. Their rationale was that they considered the ARP funds as an emergency program to provide immediate relief to households impacted by the pandemic. They wanted to know if our office had any concerns on their plan to do that. So as block grant recipients, grantees are allowed to develop policies as long as they are consistent with their state or tribal rules. We would advise the grantee to look at their own policies and procedures and to make a decision about service prioritization. Please note, however, that under ARP, there's no special federal requirements about the funds that differ from regular LIHEAP block grant funds, other than the obligation timeframe and the separate tracking and reporting. Next slide, thank you. Okay, question 6. The grantee wanted to know if they could use categorical eligibility from another low-income program that conducts income verification without collecting income information for themselves. Yes, grantees may consider these households categorically eligible for LIHEAP so long as the programs are funded under one of the federal programs listed in this statute at section 2605B2A. And those, of course, are SNAP, TANF, and SSI. However, the LIHEAP grantee remains ultimately responsible for any improper payments that may occur, whether that's under your normal income verification procedures or through categorical income eligibility procedures allowed under your own rules. If instances of payments to ineligible households are found, the grantee might be subject to a disallowance. For this question, the grantee was interested in beginning to use categorical eligibility and asked if the household is determined categorically eligible based on TANF receipt, what income amount would be used to determine a LIHEAP benefit? So for example, if a household receives TANF and reports an annual income of $18,000, can a LIHEAP grantee simply use that $18,000 amount to determine the LIHEAP benefit? Or does the grantee have to review any backup documentation and make any adjustments if the income used to determine TANF eligibility has a different, uses different inclusions or exclusions than what is used to determine income for LIHEAP purposes? Again, this is a local decision. The LIHEAP statute provides LIHEAP grantees with the flexibility of defining households as categorically eligible for LIHEAP if they have at least one member who receives assistance under other allowable federal programs, including TANF, SSI, and SNAP. However, LIHEAP might have to consider other non-income related factors depending on their other local requirements and their definition of a household. And then finally, this grantee asks if the tribe can serve eligible tribal individuals who reside off the tribal reservation. This, again, is a local decision that the tribe can make, as LIHEAP serves households and not individuals. Tribal households living outside of the reservation can apply for benefits. However, we want to see coordination between the state and the tribal program. And this, of course, would be to avoid duplication of payments and to ensure sufficient benefit coordination. And so then that will conclude our short discussion on eligibility. And with that, I will pass the baton to Patrice.
Good morning to some of you and good afternoon to others. Although this weatherization information is most likely a refresher, I wanted to start here because we have many tribal grantees that do not currently have a weatherization program and may be considering it. What is weatherization? When you notice high energy use, often referred to as energy burdens from specific households, one of the most likely causes is poor energy efficiency due to a household with older appliances that use more energy or poor insulation of the home. Simple weatherization measures can help balance some of these energy burdens. Weatherization is not housing repair, remodeling, rehabilitation, or restoration. Examples of roof replacement, siding replacement, repairing foundations, repairing sidewalks are not valid weatherization measures as they do not achieve any appreciable savings in energy consumption. The only exceptions for housing repairs are when they are needed to protect weatherization. For example, you could use LIHEAP weatherization funds to repair roof leak in order to protect the attic insulation that was installed as a weatherization measure. The LIHEAP statute is set up to provide energy-related residential home repairs, ensure it is low cost, and ensure it is cost effective. The DOE regulations are directed at residential dwellings, targeted to low income, increase energy efficiency, provide renewable energy, reduce energy costs, and improve recipient health and safety. If you include weatherization in your LIHEAP plan, it is important to ensure those funds are correctly spent and tracked. As a block grant, LIHEAP has flexibility in how its weatherization component is administered. Funding levels and the number of households served vary greatly. For example, one grantee may have $30,000 to serve 50 households, while another grantee has $10,000 to serve 200 households. Because of the large difference, the LIHEAP statute defines percentage of LIHEAP funds that can be allotted to each program's weatherization component. Also, the primary purpose of LIHEAP is to provide bill payment assistance. The LIHEAP statute permits up to 15% of the LIHEAP funds allotted or available in a federal fiscal year to be used for weatherization, unless OCS approves a waiver to obligate up to 25% of LIHEAP funds for that fiscal year. Waiver requests are made in the year for which the waiver is requested. Preliminary requests between February the 1st and March the 31st, and final requests after March 31st. So, what are weatherization earmarking requirements for ARP, CARES Act, and LIHEAP block grant funds? LIHEAP grantees must include the total of their supplemental ARP funding with all of their other FY 2021 grant award amounts, including an upcoming anticipated release of reallotment grant awards. Although this section of the webinar specifically speaks about weatherization activities, the earmarking caps limits apply to administrative costs, Assurance 16 activities, leveraging non-federal resources, planning costs, as well as weatherization activities. So for example, if a grantee received in FY 2021 a regular LIHEAP block grant of $100,000, reallotment of $10,000, CARES Act of $50,000, and ARP award of $50,000. The total funding would be $210,000. If the grantee wanted to use all funding sources to participate in weatherization, they could use $31,500, which is 15%, or $52,500, which is 25%, as a waiver. Funding sources must be kept separate for the accounting purposes. The second part of the earmarking requirement states that LIHEAP grantees that obligate supplemental funds in both FY 2021 and FY 2022 will need to carefully track the extent to which their earmarking caps are impacted by carrying over their supplemental funds into FY 2022, while not exceeding the total earmarking caps for each year. So again, here's an example. If a grantee received their regular LIHEAP block grant in FY 2022 of $150,000, they carried over 10% of $15,000. They carried over 50% of their ARP award of 25%, and their total funding would be $190,000. Their 15% of the weatherization would be $28,500, and then if they received a waiver, they could use up to $47,500. So another question, can a grantee use ARP and CARES Act funds the same as regular LIHEAP block grant funds for weatherization activities? The answer is yes. As a block grant, LIHEAP has flexibility in how its weatherization component is administered. LIHEAP CARES Act and ARP funds are for any activity you would normally be allowed to conduct under the regular LIHEAP block grant. As a reminder, it should be reflected in your plan. Also note, you must track all LIHEAP funds separately so you can report on them separately. And the ARP funds must be fully obligated by September the 30th, 2022, and your CARES Act funds by September the 30th, 2021. Another question, is public input required on the LIHEAP plan due to changes being made in the program, such as incorporating weatherization activities? You may modify your existing plan if you would like to conduct those activities during this fiscal year, or you may include the activities in your FY 2022 plan, weatherization section, which is section 6 of the plan. You will need to submit a revised FY 2021 LIHEAP plan only if you make a substantial revision as defined by you. No public hearing is required on the revised plan. You must allow for public comment, and this can be achieved by publishing to a website and open for comments to be taken. Follow your own state procedures for making administrative changes to rules or policies, and you can implement the changes without OCS approval as long as they are allowable under your own state rules. Does Davis-Bacon requirements apply to CARES Act, ARP, or regular LIHEAP funded weatherization activities? No. The Davis-Bacon Act would not apply to LIHEAP weatherization because the federal government is not a party to a contract for weatherization repair. LIHEAP is granted to the state, and the state or another organization enters into a contract. We are not aware of any special provision of ARP that will make Davis-Bacon applicable to LIHEAP weatherization. There may be state, territory, or tribal wage laws that may apply. We encourage you to review your state's prevailing wage laws to determine if they are applicable to LIHEAP weatherization activities. And lastly, is LIHEAP weatherization subject to DOE 15-year re-weatherization rule? On the screen as well, there is the memo that discusses the 15-year re-weatherization rule. The answer is LIHEAP can trigger the 15-year re-weatherization rule, but LIHEAP is not subject to the restriction. Therefore, LIHEAP could be used for weatherization during the time when DOE funds would be prohibited. We suggest that you develop a list of weatherization activities that are subject to the 15-year rule so that you can avoid triggering the limitation with LIHEAP funds. You may need the LIHEAP funds for weatherization during the 15-year restriction on the use of DOE funds. And now we'll turn it over to Joji Raghiodia to talk about the crisis assistance.
Thank you, Patrice. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. My topic is on crisis and disaster assistance. As you know, LIHEAP, given its block grant structure, gives each of you as grantees broad discretion and flexibility to make adjustment to your program, especially on your crisis assistance during the winter and throughout the rest of the summer to mitigate the risk of weather-related events such as winter storms, heat waves, and hurricanes. One flexibility that is available during a disaster is that grantees are not federally required to adhere to the 18 and 48 hours time frame during a national emergency or natural disaster. Although we strongly encourage our grantees to uphold the spirit of this requirement, you may adjust your policies as needed, and if they involve significant changes, you may submit a revised 2021 LIHEAP plan within a reasonable amount of time, but no later than September 30, 2021. And after implementing the policy changes, you do not need our prior approval. You can make changes as needed. Crisis assistance is in section 4 of your 2021 model plan. And for reference to the LIHEAP statute, crisis assistance is specifically discussed in section 2604, paragraph C. Here are a few of the questions that we receive about crisis assistance and disaster assistance. We updated 2021 plan under section 4.8 of crisis assistance to allow the following: reduce or eliminate the energy burden for the past due payment component to optimize the assistance provided to eligible household based on projected caseload, available program funding, and or circumstances that warrant an adjustment, such as moratoriums on utility payments. This is our response. This is an allowable and good practice by grantees to attempt to reduce the energy burden by reducing the co-payment or even remove it as a condition to pay past due bills. Accumulated dues of no fault of the household add to their crisis situation. So removing co-payment as a condition to receive crisis assistance help reduce stress and their crisis situation. Please ensure that this policy is documented in your policy manual and communicated to your network. Another question that we received was how to document data on intervention provided. We are adding data collection field to our automated system. Is HHS requiring that we document the hours between determining eligibility and mitigating the crisis, or would it be sufficient to capture days? Our response was, based on LIHEAP statute section 2604, paragraph C, and assurance 10, grantees are required to document the intervention provided and are encouraged to include a timestamp or field in their application form if you have a system that indicates the start and end date when an intervention has been provided, and not when the application has been processed or the benefit amount is paid issued, unless this is your definition of intervention. Some of you have this kind of definition of intervention. Can we use ARPA funds to provide temporary housing under crisis assistance for victims of hurricanes? Our answer is providing temporary housing as a result of the disaster is allowable. Disaster-related activities as part of the crisis assistance. As cited in the Dear Colleague letter, LIHEAP 2021-03, when such natural disaster occur, funding from the LIHEAP may be used to assist LIHEAP eligible household with crisis assistance. It is within its LIHEAP grantee discretion to determine what constitute a qualifying disaster, what forms of financial and or assistance to provide, and other related matters. Unless the interpretation is clearly erroneous. If in doubt, I would suggest that you call or email your liaison for a specific response to your situation. Another response that we have is grantees may change their program benefits and assistance types through the federal fiscal year to address unexpected natural disaster and other needs. Grantees must submit a written plan amendment to OCS. However, such plan amendments do not need prior approval, as I have mentioned before, and they may be sent within a reasonable time after the disaster and all plan modification, but no later than September 30, 2021. Next slide, please. I would like to highlight here some allowable examples of assistance intervention that you could offer to household in crisis, including those who have been impacted by disasters. And for detailed information, you can refer to LIHEAP DCL 2021-03 that we issued on February 25, 2021. So crisis assistance may come in many forms. So for example, a grantee may choose to provide bill payment assistance to crisis household within the allowable time frame. And with regards to benefit beyond bill payment assistance, we strongly encourage grantees to consider the health-related issues posed by this pandemic as it relates to household energy, especially using CARES Act fund. This doesn't apply, however, to LIHEAP formula and ARPA. So given that COVID-19 is primarily an airborne virus which spreads most easily indoors, grantees may consider the extent to which, for example, they provide household with air conditioning units as opposed to fans. As you know, an air conditioning unit will provide improved indoor quality compared to a fan. Grantee may choose as well to use required set-aside crisis funds to provide year-round crisis assistance. So you can provide year-round crisis assistance versus just during the winter or during the summer. So others may choose to issue supplemental benefits to households safe from falling into recurring home energy crisis. A grantee may also choose to utilize LIHEAP crisis funds to repair and replace cooling as well as hot water systems, and also use the crisis assistance funds during the disaster. So during the disaster, I have the next slide shows the different examples of interventions. And I will not mention everything here, but it's all included in the DCL as well as in the next two slides. So I will just be highlighting a few of those. So disaster interventions are allowable services provided to your eligible household affected by disasters, such as winter storms, heat waves, and hurricanes. So for instance, you could provide temporary shelter or house individuals in hotels, apartments, or other living situation in which homes have been destroyed or damaged, placing people in settings to prevent health and safety to move temporarily away from the crisis situation. So please remember this word, temporary shelter. So this is one particular area where if you have another question about the temporary, like the due date and the timeline, please call your liaison and discuss this with them. So cost for transportation, cost for cars, shuttles, buses, to move individuals away from the crisis area to shelters when health and safety is endangered by loss of access to heating or cooling. Also like, transportation for to access cooling centers. Those are allowable. And other examples here, as I've mentioned. So references for crisis assistance are added at the resource slide of this presentation, which is at the very end of this PowerPoint. Please reserve your questions later or add those in the chat feature of this webinar. So thank you all for listening, and I am now turning over the presentation to Kate Thomas. Here you go, Kate.
All right, everyone, wake up. I'm going to tell you a few more ways you can spend your money. and about a few more grantee questions that we have received that fall into the miscellaneous category. Before I do that, let me remind you that we have urged you to consider issuing supplemental benefits. As a reminder, supplemental benefits are those additional benefits to individuals already approved once during the current year who do not need to apply again in order to receive an additional benefit that would be auto applied to their energy bill account. You also have some other options to finish spending the CARES dollars as soon as possible. And actually, these activities are okay for you to conduct with any of your LIHEAP funds, including your CARES dollars, your regular LIHEAP block grant funds, and your ARPA funds. You may want to consider increasing your allowable income of households. Is it at the maximum allowed already? As Vicki mentioned earlier, remember that you can allow a household to earn up to 60% of the state median income or 150% of the federal poverty guidelines, whichever is greater. And it can also be a combination of the two, depending on the household size. You can look at your applications that are missing documentation or are otherwise incomplete. Maybe they could be easily resolved. It's a good time to take a look at those applications at this point in the year. Consider if you can open your summer cooling program back up if it's already closed, or reopen your crisis component. Consider paying past due balances. Even if the household is not imminently due to be disconnected, maybe that's a requirement right now. You may also want to consider relaxing your stance on paying some of those fees that you've excluded in the past. Another option is if you don't already have a summer cooling program, a weatherization component, or perhaps a repair and replacement component in your program, consider adding these optional activities to your LIHEAP. Consider increasing your maximum benefit amounts. Consider things that you may not have been able to afford in the past, like taking a deep dive into the reason some of your households are using so much energy and working to resolve those underlying causes, like perhaps an inefficient wood stove, a furnace, or an air conditioning unit. Next slide, please. Now, to move on to some of the specific questions that LIHEAP grantees have asked us here at OCS over the past year or so, these questions are from your peers. So you may have wondered the same thing in some of these scenarios. One question that we get a lot is, do I have to charge this to admin, or does this count against my admin cap? In other words, do I have flexibility in defining what administrative cost means at my state or tribe or territory? And the good news is, yes, you do have some flexibility here. And actually, to be quite frank, it is your responsibility to locate the policies that your state, tribe, or territory has on administrative cost and what all activities that policy includes. If the policy doesn't prevent you from charging some activities to the non-administrative portion of your LIHEAP grant, then you may be able to do so. For instance, some grantees charge time of their staff conducting LIHEAP intake to the program cost, not the admin cost portion of your grant. And this is something you can consider to stretch your budget a little further if allowed by your administrative definition and policies. Please note that we've issued some prior guidance on administrative costs, which can be found in LIHEAP IM 2000-12, which is located on our website, and we'll have a link to it in the resources page of this PowerPoint. Have you asked yourself lately if there's any way around the 10% administrative cost cap? This is a question we receive from grantees a lot in relation to the CARES and ARPA funds and flexibility surrounding those funds. And unfortunately, no. The rule of all LIHEAP funds is 10% maximum for states. For tribes, it's 20% on the first 20,000 and then 10% after that. So unfortunately, there's really no flexibility in those cost caps for LIHEAP funds, even the latest funding. A lot of grantees have been adding cooling components to their LIHEAP this year with the additional funds. Some of them have wondered if there are any stipulations on purchasing various types of air conditioning units, window units, wall-mounted units, portable air conditioners, etc. There's so many different options for air conditioners. And there is a lot of information on this slide, so I'll just tell you the short answer is yes. Our main stipulation is that you must adequately track all of the inventory and all of the LIHEAP funds. So you must have the activity also reported in your plan. Those are the two main stipulations. You can put AC units in the cooling component, section 3 of your model plan, the crisis component, which is section 4, or the weatherization component, which is section 5. So you have a lot of options. Make sure it's in your plan and make sure that you're adequately tracking all of those funds separately and that you're tracking the inventory. A couple questions that us liaisons here get a lot is, can we use some of our LIHEAP funds to upgrade our intake or eligibility screening systems? And is there a limit on that type of activity, on the amount of funds that can be put towards an IT system upgrade? And these are really great and important questions because, as we all know, modernizing our technology can really enhance the efficiency of our programs, provide better security and program integrity, and just generally make your lives easier as program administrators, right? So the answer is, if your definitions and policies allow it, LIHEAP program funds or non-admin funds can be used to develop or build a new eligibility and or LIHEAP management system. However, typically ongoing maintenance is normally considered an administrative expense, but there is no cap on the dollar amount that you spend in building that service if it falls within your 10%, if it falls, whichever way it falls into your definitions and policies. So you just have to first figure out if this expense is subject to the administrative cost cap based on your policies and definitions for administrative cost. A couple caveats to note about this are that you may have a multi-year contract for IT work supported by multiple sources of funds, but all federal LIHEAP funds, for example, the regular LIHEAP block grant, CARES Act, ARP funds, and other funds must be tracked separately. We advise that the contract remain active for the duration of the IT work being performed, but we leave the specific details up to you based on your own procurement policies to dictate. Also note, we consider a signed contract with a software vendor a legal obligation. However, note that there's no federal LIHEAP definition of obligation, and each grantee should use your own definition and procurement policies to execute contracts. In general, remember the rule of thumb is if it's not allowable under your own grantee rules, it should not be allowable under LIHEAP rules. Now, this is an interesting one. Some grantees have wondered if there is a way to incentivize staff to keep coming to work during this really scary time. For instance, can I pay them a little more or give them a bonus? And the answer is yes. It may need to count toward your administrative cost cap, and it should be in sync with your existing policies. But if it is permitted under your own rules or not prevented by your own rules regarding your own state, tribe, or territory funds, then hazard pay would be an allowable activity. Now, here's a fun one. Many of you have asked us or asked yourself, can we purchase a car or a truck for our LIHEAP program? We desperately need a new vehicle, yada, yada. So we have issued guidance on this before, but if you don't know, the answer to this question is yes, you can. Many LIHEAP grantees have purchased vehicles for conducting home visits, outreach, enrollment events, weatherization activities, even things like hauling wood. Just make sure that your own policies, again, on the purchase of vehicles applies. One caveat to this is to just make sure you find out if this purchase must count towards your administrative cost cap. That's an internal decision, but make sure you have the decisions well documented and that the policies supporting your decision are written in a clear way. Now, here are a few resources you can always reference for more information and details about LIHEAP and the flexibilities allowed under the block grant, including some of the questions that we've discussed today. There are other questions that we've received over the last year that we haven't gone over today, and many of those could be answered by looking at some of these links as well. But please know that we're here to try to help you locate the information you need or help answer any questions you have. And as always, for more information about anything that we didn't get to today that you want to cover or we don't get to today, please reach out to us anytime, any of these email addresses, and we'll be happy to try to help. So now I'm going to turn it over to John Thompson, an auditor in our office, to field some of today's questions that we have received in the chat box. John?
Thank you, Kate. I want to first thank the whole team, the DEA team, for such an informative presentation. It spoke of many things like eligibility, what types must be excluded versus what can be excluded, great tips regarding weatherization and how it can assist in the obligating of funds if you don't have a weatherization program yet. There are many forms that crisis assistance can come and how you can use those funds in your to obligate your supplemental funds. And you just heard from Kate the many ways that you can use miscellaneous funds and how you can use that, especially since we've received such a large influx of CARES Act and ARP funds. So, you know, I really hope that this, more than anything, not just I, but the whole team, really hope that this webinar was informative. It may have sparked your minds to be creative in using some funds that in ways that you have not thought of. And just as Iris mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we really would not like to see the funds come back. We really hope that the funds find their way to serving all of the clients within LIHEAP. So with that said, we did receive some questions during the chat, and some were answered already. Will slides be available? The answer is yes. We will share the slide deck in the recording of today's webinar. There was one question, well, I'll read it exactly. I recall a 200% FPL allowability for services in a Dear Colleague letter with CARES Act. Is this true?
Hi, John.
Yes.
This is Lauren.
Sorry,
I can jump in with that one. So unless you can find that link and send it to me, I'm not aware of us saying in a prior Dear Colleague letter that the main LIHEAP bill payment assistance can be exceeded to greater than 150% of FPG or 60% of state median income. So remembering that the federal LIHEAP statute allows each of you as the grantee to set that income eligibility cap at the greater of 150% federal poverty guidelines or 60% state median income, SMI. And in some cases, that 60% of SMI may exceed 150%, et cetera. So whichever the greater is what your cap is, and you can set it at that cap or lower, no lower than 110% of federal poverty guidelines. But nowhere in our guidance, to my knowledge, have we said that that could go up to 200% of FPG if that isn't what your SMI works out to. So what one of our prior speakers was trying to clarify is that the 200% FPG is what's allowed under the Department of Energy's Weatherization Assistance Program, the WAP. And if you are using that WAP rule for your LIHEAP funded weatherization, then for your LIHEAP funded weatherization assistance, you can go as high as 200% FPG. But that's for your weatherization component. For your other components on heating, crisis, cooling, assistance, that is where it's either 150% of FPG or 60% of SMI, whichever is the higher of those two levels. So hopefully that's clarified. And I see a follow-up in the chat box about CSBG. That's possible. Now, we did issue a Dear Colleague letter back on April 1st of 2020, over a year ago, and I'm going to add that link to the chat box here just to remind people of that. And we do talk about some issues regarding income eligibility, but we don't talk about any sort of increase to 200% of FPG. John, what's the next question?
Thank you, Lauren. Okay, the next question is, well, I think you answered that just now, Lauren. The next question is, I've been under the impression for years that we could go over 100% FPG, provided it was no higher than our state's 60% SMI. Have I misunderstood? I believe that you just addressed that.
Right.
Right.
So if your 60% SMI winds up being higher than the 150% FPG, then that's fine. You go with whatever that 60% SMI equates to. That's fine.
Okay, thank you. And our next question is from the San Carlos Apache tribe. When a tribe decides to do weatherization, is this deducted from the LIHEAP funds, or is this separate funding? I will pass that over to Iris Curtis, our supervisory auditor.
All right, thanks, John. So when you're considering to do weatherization, you'll look at your total funding amount, and you can use up to 15% of your funds for weatherization. If you'd like to use more than 15%, you can submit a waiver request to our office, and we will take a look at that, respond. If that waiver is accepted, then you can use up to 25%. So it is of your total LIHEAP funding you can use for weatherization, up to 15, or with the waiver up to 25%. John?
Thank you, Iris. Our next question. Many towns include the cost of water, fuel adjustment charges, EMS services, fire department services, sewer, etc., onto the energy bill. Can help pay for these charges? Akam?
Yes, thank you, John. So this question actually mentions quite a few different charges, and we have clarified in the past that past due bills and any kind of charges from utility companies related to undue balance, those are allowable. However, water, sanitation, sewer charges, those are not allowable. So there could be certain things within a electric bill or a heating bill that is allowable, but most of the items that are listed here, they're not.
Thank you, Agam. Next question we have is, should we be including carryover of ARP funds into the total calculations of our F22 plan? Lauren?
Yes, your ARP fund should be, sorry, the ARP
Go ahead.
It can be carried over into fiscal year 2020, but I believe there is a separate line item even in that carryover report. So you will still put it on a separate line item, but it will be carried over into your fiscal year 2020. Remember, we said that in fiscal year 2021, you can obligate anywhere from 0 to 100%. So whatever you don't obligate in fiscal year 21, you would carry over and obligate into 22.
Right. I would just piggyback on that to clarify. So Iris is talking about your 2021 carryover and reallotment report. We have not released that in the system, the OLDC system yet, but our IT team is working on those updates, and we will send you all a notice as soon as that report is available to you for this reporting period. But there will be a specific line item on that report for the ARPA money. And even though there's no cap as to how much you can carry over, we'd still like to know how much did you obligate this year versus are you planning to obligate in 2022. With respect to your 2022 model plan, we did not seek any sort of revisions to the normal LIHEAP plan. So you will not see any specific questions on the plan regarding any supplemental funding, whether it's CARES, ARPA, or other future supplementals. We have not revised it for that at this point. However, you have lots of opportunities throughout your plan to make any sort of caveats or distinctions or clarifications that you need to in your plan in terms of things that you might just do with only ARPA money or only CARES money. For example, say you, for 2022, you only plan to have a cooling program if you use your ARPA money for it. If you wind up not having enough ARPA money left over, then you won't run a cooling component. That's fine. You can still check off on your model plan, cooling component, your estimated dates, and then I believe there's a field box below that question where you can clarify that the cooling component will be funded only out of ARPA money, and that assumes that there's ARPA money left over by that point in time. To the extent that you need to make a clarification and you don't see a field box for a question, in order to make that clarification, you can certainly add an attachment to your plan. It can just be a plain Word document that you attach with any sort of special notices you want to make about your ARPA money. And just remember that the plan serves at least 3 important purposes. One, sure, it's to notify us, your federal grantor, how you intend to use the funds, but frankly, more importantly, 2, is to notify your own communities about what they should anticipate with how your program will run as opposed to somebody else's. So what are they likely to expect in terms of their own eligibility, what they can qualify for, et cetera. So looking at it through that lens, as well as through the third purpose, which is to make sure you at the grantee level and any sub-grantees that you might be working with are all on the same page in terms of how your own program will run. So from that sort of implementation planning purpose, looking at how you're wording it so that it's kind of clear to those different audiences, any distinctions that are kind of unique to your ARPA funding. So again, there's no question in the plan that asks, what are you doing with your ARPA money? But you can make those clarifications as you feel is needed in the appropriate sections of the plan, because we have lots of open field boxes that you can make use of throughout the plan. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Lauren. Our next question is, should we? Oh, I'm sorry, I just read that one. When we choose to issue supplemental benefits to households, do we need to adjust our plan?
I'll take that. So the model plan, I want to answer it slightly differently. The short answer is no. If you're only making a supplemental payment, I think the important thing is to make sure that your population knows about this change. But model plan changes, what drives that is this substantial changes standard. So for example, if you're making substantial changes to your model plan, we would expect you to make a revision. However, you don't need a prior approval. So if you want to decide to issue supplemental benefit to your customer, you don't need a prior approval. You can just let us know after you make the policy change. And again, the substantial change that is defined by you as a grantee, we normally don't keep a list of what is a substantial change versus what is a non-substantial change. Lauren, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, so with a supplemental benefit, if you try to think through what is really changing in your plan because of that, the only connection I can really see is that it's impacting how much in benefits your household wind up qualifying for. So, you know, if in your beginning of your, at the beginning of your year, if your plan said, well, we anticipate this is how benefits will be calculated, we think the maximum benefit will be whatever it is, $300, $1,000 for the year. And then at some point in the year, you wind up doing supplemental benefit payments that wind up taking some households over the maximum that you had put in your plan. Then I think it could be helpful if you were to do a revised plan to flag that for people. And frankly, this is the sort of example where it is potentially less important that the households out there know about it, because presumably with a supplemental benefit payment, you're more or less doing that automatically, right? You know which households you've already served that year, and you're just making a blanket decision that everyone you've already served this year, you're now going to make another benefit payment of whatever that is. $50, $500, $1,000, whatever you need to use up your CARES money, that becomes your new maximum. Calculate how many households you serve that year, how much money you have left to use up, divide it by the number of households you served, and that winds up being their new maximum, right? And it probably means in some cases that that's going to result in credit balances for the future. That's okay for LIHEAP. So, so the household, you know, this is great news. So that's a great surprise. I got more LIHEAP benefit than I anticipated. So really, the benefit in doing a revised plan in that sort of situation is mostly for your own internal documentation purposes, so that when auditors come out to look at your program or people monitor your program, they can compare your plan and see, oh yeah, well, their maximum was such and such. But as Akam emphasized, whenever you submit a revised plan to us, you do not need our prior approval or acceptance of that plan in order to move forward with implementing the change. The only exception, literally one exception to that rule, relates to how much money you spend towards weatherization. That is the one thing that's written into the federal law, that if you want to spend more than 15% of your LIHEAP grant towards weatherization, you do need our prior written approval, and there's a whole separate process outside of the plan that relates to a weatherization waiver request. That is the only exception. Any other change that you make to your program throughout any given year, whether it's a pandemic year or a non-pandemic year, you do not need our prior approval for. You can make the change and you can submit a revised plan to us later on when you get a chance to catch your breath and catch up with that, okay? So, you know, right now, as we're nearing this 2-month mark to be able to use that CARES money, make the change. Worry about notifying us later. Make the change. One thing we have to emphasize is that to the extent you are making substantial changes to your program, you are supposed to get public participation. But just remember, public participation does not look the same in every situation. This is not the same sort of public participation that you do on your plan at the beginning of the year, because that's a big deal, right? We're coming into a new year, and so we want to make sure everybody in the community as possible hears about what's going to be different for that year. When you're making little changes throughout the year, and little changes, I mean, you're not completely revamping the entire program, maybe you are, but the point is, it's not the same thing as the first plan submission for the year. So make the later public participation opportunities to fit the situation. So if you know you've got 2 months left, you need to work with your fiscal teams to get supplemental payments out by mid-August maybe, or late August. You're not going to have much of a window for public participation. So maybe you're posting a notice on your website for a few days, or maybe you're having one call with some of your key stakeholders. Say if you're a state working with subgrantees, you organize a quick call with some of your subgrantees to talk about this upcoming supplemental payment. Whatever is feasible and realistic for you, for what you can do in order to not miss that opportunity of implementing that program change, that's what you do. Okay, so doesn't have to be 30 days of public comment, doesn't have to involve a hearing. That is not required. Okay, just, you know, a quick check, a quick pulse check with people. Hey, we're going to issue supplemental benefit payments. We're probably going to do it in late August, FYI. And if anyone has any concerns with that, here's how you let us know, right? And you move forward with it. As Akam said, the window is still open, but just for a little bit longer. So all those ideas that he had on that slide near the beginning of the webinar, please take a close look at that and really think through what is feasible for you if you still have CARES money, or say you're in a great place with your CARES money, but suddenly you got a lot of ARPA money and you're figuring out what to do with that. Same situation. Our team is going to be calling grantees one by one for those grantees that we see have not drawn down much of their CARES Act money. And this is not just going to be a reminder call saying you got CARES Act money, because we're assuming you know that, that you're tracking your own money. We're actually going to have a conversation with you, trying to understand, why do you still have that money on hand? What are your intentions with that money? Helping to brainstorm with you what options are feasible for you and what target date you can implement them. So we're going to do our best to help you on a one-by-one basis to get those actions into place so that hopefully zero CARES Act money gets returned. Because again, remember, there's no reallotment with CARES Act. We will not get another bite at that apple. And you know, to the extent that our grantees can't use their CARES money or their ARPA money, that is not going to benefit the program in the longer run when Congress is deciding future funding for the program, right? We want to make sure that we can show that we are using all of the money, because we know the need is out there. We know on average we're reaching maybe 1 in every 5 eligible households. In some places, it's far less than that. So whatever you need to do to use that money in a proper way, increase those benefit amounts, issue supplemental payments, there are lots of options, and we will discuss those with you on a one-by-one basis. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Lauren. And definitely not a soapbox. That was definitely facts. I really appreciate you saying that to our grantees, of how we're really going to just be involved in the process, really to help them out with CARES Act funding. And so the next question we have, and we really appreciate the questions, they're really rolling in now, which shows y'all are very engaged in this part of the webinar. The next question we have is, what obligation does a grantee have for households receiving LIHEAP? Does DHHS require that applicants provide a Social Security number for all household members 2 years of age or older as part of qualifying for LIHEAP? I'm going to first probably start with Akam, unless Lauren, if you want to start with that, and then that's definitely a thought-provoking.
You go ahead, please.
Sure, and you jump in if there's something I forget. So I'm just going to repeat the question one more time to make sure I got it. It was really a two-part question. The first question was, what obligation does a grantee have related to documenting legal status to be in the U.S. for households receiving LIHEAP? So again, we're talking specifically about LIHEAP today. It was determined many years ago that LIHEAP is a means-tested public assistance program. And the significance of that decision was that under the PRORA legislation, I don't know, from the mid to late 90s, the legislation that kind of transformed the welfare system into what we have now, the TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. That legislation actually said that any federal means-tested public assistance program has a requirement that the household members be U.S. citizens or a term of art that was in the legislation called qualified alien. And it's a long story. The Department of Justice had been working on some guidance regarding how to verify the status of household members regarding that. There was some preliminary guidance that was published in the Federal Register by just Department of Justice years ago, but to my knowledge, there's never been any final guidance or final rules issued. So we had issued an information memorandum back in, I want to say 2014, thereabouts, where we tried to clarify this issue of, you know, do I have to deny an entire household LIHEAP service just because there may be one or more household members that don't have that citizenship or qualified alien status? And in that guidance document from our office, we said, no, you can still serve those households if there's some sort of mixed eligibility status. But what we ask you to do is to prorate the amount of the LIHEAP benefit based on the number of eligible household members. So, you know, one example you might see out there a lot is maybe a family where the parents are, you know, lacking citizenship or qualified alien status, but maybe they have children who were born in the U.S. So the children have the citizenship status, but their parents don't. So let's say it's two parents and two kids. Half the parents don't have the status, but the kids do. A household can still be approved as eligible for LIHEAP, but instead of saying you've got 4 people in the household, when you go to do the benefit calculation, you'd say there are 2 people in the household for purposes of calculating that benefit. The second question here is, and I'll try to find that IM and put that link in the chat box, but the second question is, does HHS require that applicants provide a social security number for all household members 2 years of age or older as part of applying for LIHEAP? That's a very specific question. So in that same IM, as well as an IM that we released back in 2010, I believe it was IM number 6 from 2010. And I remember that year because of a certain GAO report that came out that year. We said that we don't have the authority to require you to require social security numbers. However, we just lack the federal authority to do that. However, we strongly, strongly encourage all of you to collect social security numbers for everyone in the household. You know, babies can get social security numbers. You know, it's just a form of program integrity to try to have some information to show that if someone's claiming they have 8 people in their household, there's something we could check to verify that. Now, you know, again, it's something we strongly encourage. We don't require. We, again, strongly encourage that you collect it for everyone in the household, not just the applicant. I'll try to find both of those IMs to put the links in the chat box. But, you know, we know this past year in particular has been extremely challenging. Anytime you're dealing with some sort of disaster, you know, people are going to have a harder time trying to get the supporting documents that they normally need to apply for the program. So, I know each of you have been in a difficult situation of trying to figure out what's that happy balance between how do we reduce the risk of improper payments, making benefit payments to households that really aren't eligible for the program, versus making it so onerous for people to apply that we don't get people coming in to apply for the program who really are eligible. So finding that balance between what's feasible for them to collect and give to you versus what's too much. So, it's not unlike when you're working with FEMA or other agencies during a disaster, what do you do when people are displaced and what have you? So I don't have any great ideas around that. But to the extent feasible, we encourage you to collect Social Security numbers. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Lauren. And our next question is, can a grantee pay a light bill, for instance, of someone who is not eligible at all for the program, but has expressed and proved their inability to make payments to restore their services? And the answer to that question.
Sure. Thank you, John. I'll take that. So the question is, can they pay for someone's light bill if the person is not eligible for LIHEAP at all? The short answer is no, but I would give some advice. For example, during this pandemic, many people have lost jobs, they have changed, they have a different income situation. So I would really encourage the grantee to look at the household situation and see if the person is actually eligible, because situation changes, as you know. So maybe someone is not eligible, the household is not eligible today, was not eligible, let's say 2 weeks ago, but now they're eligible. So that's the first part. The second thing is, if they're not eligible for LIHEAP, you cannot provide them with LIHEAP, federal LIHEAP assistance. And the standard is set by you. As we discussed this before, your income eligibility threshold is anywhere between 150 and 150% of federal poverty guidelines or 60% of SMI, whichever is greater. So based on your own income standard, if the household is not eligible at all, then you cannot assist them with federal LIHEAP funds. However, we would always encourage you to look for other funding to see if you can assist the household. Sometimes just making a phone call to the utility companies to see if they have other funds available, or if you have tribal or state funds, we would encourage you to use that.
Thank you, Akam. Next question. Under crisis, can we replace heating and cooling system? Under crisis, it will be about, the amount will be let me go back and read that again, I'm sorry. Under crisis, can we replace cooling and heating system? Under crisis, it will be the amount to resolve the crisis. An example, the new heating cooling system will be $7,000. So, Akam, will pass that to you first?
Okay. Many grantees do that. They have a equipment repair and replacement program under their crisis benefit crisis process. So that is something that is allowable. There is and also the amount that is set by you, as I mentioned during my opening remarks, that there is no set federal maximum benefit. So if you think that that amount is allowable, then you can set your policy accordingly. I encourage you to have written policies and guidelines around it. Even though the crisis response timeframe does not directly apply during the pandemic, I would like you to think about that, because if you allocate funds for crisis assistance, whether for equipment repair or just a crisis bill payment assistance, the normal 18 and 48-hour rule would apply in a normal circumstance. But we have already held this that during the pandemic, that strict response time does not apply. However, we have encouraged our grantees to understand the reason behind having such a set time frame, because we don't want a household to get into a really crisis situation or lose their life because a grantee did not respond to the crisis on time.
Thank you, April. And we're coming close to wrapping up, I believe, but I'm going to read one more question. And it is, can we do HVAC repair replacement with ARPA funds as a crisis payment? If so, do we need to update our model plan for FY21? I think, Lauren, you had alluded to how we can update the model plan. What were the reasons we could update the model plan earlier? I don't know if you wanted to give a quick recap of what you had said before.
Sure. This question was specifically about HVAC systems, you said?
Yes, it was. I'll read it one more time. It said, can we do HVAC repair replacement with ARPA funds as a crisis payment? If so, do we need to update our model plan for FY 2021?
Okay. So yeah, all the normal purposes you can use your LIHEAP funding for, you can use for your ARPA funding. And so say normally with your regular LIHEAP grant, you wouldn't have enough money to actually do equipment repair or replacement or to buy new equipment if the household hasn't had it. But now with ARPA, you do feel like you're in a position to fund that. That is great. You can move forward with that. Again, in your plan, there's the different sections that talk about your different components, like your heating assistance, your crisis component, your cooling component. So you'd want to decide, which component or components you're going to fund that sort of equipment purchase or repair services through. And you would want to note that in the respective section of the plan. Again, there are field boxes where you can put a little note, a little asterisk saying, equipment purchase or repair will be funded with ARPA money only, and that would be great. And, given all this extreme weather that parts of the country have been experiencing this summer in particular, with historic heat waves and ongoing wildfires, and just continues, we just would encourage you, to the extent that you do have CARES or ARPA money, that you're kind of trying to think through what else can you use it for. If you're not currently funding air conditioning units, that you consider that as something you might do with your CARES or ARPA money, because, we put out some, I think it was a Dear Colleague letter and some blogs and some social media tweets and what have you, maybe a month or so ago, about how much more effective air conditioning can be than just fans alone. And that is particularly true when you're talking about certain households with vulnerable members, particularly seniors or people on certain medications, or with really young children, because they will feel smaller differences in temperature much more quickly and much more substantially than your average healthy adult. And what we were reading about was that, especially when you're talking about drier parts of the country, using fans by themselves when the temperatures get really extreme, when it's 95 degrees or hotter, is actually counterproductive, particularly for your at-risk households like your seniors, because the fans typically are helping to evaporate moisture. So if someone's sweating because they're hot, the fan can be helpful. But seniors, we know, don't sweat as much or as effectively as younger, healthier adults. And so if there really isn't that humidity or that sweating condition, just running a fan is actually going to be more like turning on your convection oven. It's going to heat the person up faster and actually contribute to hyperthermia, overheating much faster. So to the extent that you have money that you're trying to figure out what to earmark it for, if you're not really spending much or anything towards air conditioning units, I would encourage you to consider that, because especially for these parts of the country where people lack them entirely because they're not used to this kind of weather, I think we have to start planning for what if this is something we continue to experience, unfortunately. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Lauren. And I want to thank everyone for all your questions. We've already went over time already, but I wanted to just make a few notes that Lauren and Acom did post those IMs in the chat box. So if you're able to go in the chat box and see those links that they have put there for your reference, I'd greatly encourage you to do so. Also, I want to thank the entire DEA team. I don't know if we could all show our faces again before we all sign off. But I want to tell everyone before we sign off that if you have any questions that were not addressed, to please send them to your liaisons so they can be answered, because all your questions were important, and it just shows your commitment to wanting to get the most out of our program. So with that said, just want to say goodbye to everyone, and DA.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.